right?
And we should
However, the most pertinent and the most important question, I think, is if there is a God, and I emphasize the point if, what does God say objectively about eating meat? Because for me, that's going to be far more important if there is a God than perhaps what he would say, or I would think, or what you might say. Do you see my point? And so that's why I would ask you that, have you pondered on the concept of the Creator, and what is it perhaps that does not persuade you or convince you that there might be a Creator? Can I ask you what that might be, or what is
I just basically don't have that faith or belief to believe there is a Creator. Fair enough. But I would like to believe that if there was a Creator, that Creator would encourage us to respect everything they created, to the land, the non-human animals, and the human animals. Everything. He's given life, or he's given life. And so we should respect that. Veganism's not about perfection. It's almost impossible to be perfect in this world. We're always going to be causing harm along the way at some point. Just by existing. Just basically doing the best that one can to reduce that suffering as much as reasonably feasibly possible. So us living in this country with that abundance of alternatives, access to grocery stores, I believe our Creator would want us to cause the least amount of suffering, but the most amount of suffering. If you ever seen slaughterhouse footage, etc., I think all of us care, would never want to intentionally harm an animal ourselves, ever. I think so.
You see, a lot of what you've raised, a lot of it I would agree with. It's not objective. It's a subjective analysis. You'd agree with that?
I agree.
Right. So my point is that intrinsically, the consumption of an animal or not the consumption of an animal, I feel humbly, should be more of an objective stance rather than a subjective one. Because you've raised a lot of things like fairness and not causing harm and not being cruel, but those things are not absolutes even within the actual concept of cruelty, for example. So what you might deem as cruel, perhaps I might not, or this brother might not. You see my point? So what I would say to you is that, so within the concept of Islam, actually a lot of animal rights are disclosed. So for example, we're told that there is the Prophet ﷺ told the people about a Jewish lady who was a sinner, basically, and she found a dog that was thirsty, and so she takes off her shoe and she got water in her shoe and she fed the dog. And Allah was so pleased by that act of mercy that she showed the dog that Allah granted her paradise and granted her forgiveness. We have another occasion where a camel comes to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet asks the owner to come, and he says that your animal is complaining to me, that you overburden it, that you don't feed it, and that you beat it. And then Allah explains to the companion that the Prophet, the Prophet peace be upon him, explains to the companion that this is part of your religion, basically, to be compassionate, to be caring to animals. Now, the Prophet's own example was that he ate meat sometimes once, only in a few months. And this was on occasion when often he was invited for a meal, that he ate meat. And it may have been after 2 months or 3 months that he may have had a little bit of, and in those days it was mainly goat, lamb, goat, or camel. They didn't have beef, they didn't have cattle. And in fact, we have another saying of the second Caliph, Umar Khattab radiallahu anhu, when he catches a man going to the bazaar, and he says, "Where are you going?" And he says, "I'm going to buy meat." And he said, "But you bought meat yesterday. Don't you know the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that there is disease in meat?"
I agree with you. It's addictive.
Right? Now this is 14 centuries ago in a medieval town, he's been told, and the Prophet ﷺ said, for example, do not consume too much meat because it will harden your hearts. And in fact, today's science tells us that one of the right now, this is a nomad, a nomad in the 7th century, only known for herding goats, is giving them profound teachings about animals. Do you understand my point? However, in Islam, the consumption of meat is not haram, simply because, like you said yourself, sometimes there is a need. So there are some communities around the world where, for example, Eskimos can't have plant-based diets because there aren't any plants there. They survive solely on seal meat and fish and these sort of things. You understand my point? So there is a need. If Allah had made it haram, forbidden, those people would have died. You understand my point? But you make a very valid point, a very valid argument, that our production of meat today, our consumption of meat today, I think is inherently cruel. I would accept that. And in fact, that's the reason what prompted me. It was the guilt, really, that Allah has ordained something tayyib, which is just, fair, merciful, wholesome, good, which is to rear the animal with great care, and it has to be slaughtered in a very, very specific way. So, for example, the animal should not see the knife. The animal should not see, other animals should not see that animal being slaughtered. The knife has to be sharpened to an extent whereby it reaches the back of the jugular within the 3rd stroke. With the Jews, it's the 1st stroke. Now, we learned, there was a study done in Hanover University. It's an old study, and though some people have criticized it, for me it still seems fairly robust, because they used EEG and ECG monitors on the animal's brain. They inserted probes in the brain of some sheep goats, and then they allowed those probes to heal, and then they slaughtered them with the stunning method and the shahita or shahita method, which is the Jewish method, and the halal method, to compare the pain and suffering to the animal whilst it was being slaughtered. Now, the surprising thing is that the least amount of pain and suffering that they found was the halal and kosher method, because the pain sensory nerves behind the jugular were severed within a split of a second, and the animal lost consciousness. It was in a state of semi-consciousness, and by looking at the animal, though, however, it felt like the animal was kicking and moving around, so it looked like it was in agony. But the kosher and the halal method of slaughter enforces a very important rule, which is to maintain the cut only to the depth of the jugular, and you can't sever the spinal cord. If you sever the spinal cord, I think in Judaism, even accidentally, the animal is forbidden. In Islam, if you do it deliberately, the animal is forbidden. You can't eat the animal. So it's a very precise way of slaughter. And by leaving the spinal cord intact, the brain registers a lack of blood pressure to the brain, and it tells the animal to exercise, to push the blood to the brain, and by that process the animal becomes healthier, because we know that a lot of the toxins, a lot of the, if you have an animal that has congealed blood in it, it goes off faster, and it certainly doesn't taste as nice either. But you're quite right that our current production is, I think, quite cruel. But as a Muslim, what we would say is that because our objective morality comes from Islam and from Allah, from God, the one who created those animals and created us, that we would humbly say that we believe that therefore we would be closer to the truth in terms of how to consume animals. So what I would suggest to you, brother, is that though I think it's very commendable, as I say, that what you're doing, I think is great because you're reducing suffering to animals, right? And encouraging others to do that.
Well, not just animals, like the planets as well.
Of course, because if we reduce our beef consumption by just 10%, apparently we sort out global warming, climate change.
I think it needs to be a lot more than that.
No. I read a study that even if it was just 10%, it would single-handedly sort out, climate change. I'm not saying that we should just reduce it by 10%, but I'm just saying even a small improvement would make a massive difference to the world. And the amazing thing is that these things that you are so passionate about, you will find in Islam.
Yeah. You brought up the idea that there's a right way to kill. I definitely believe there's better ways of killing someone. Yes. I say someone because they have thoughts and feelings and personalities. They're not objects. They're not an it.
Of course.
They're actually someone.
Of course.
But do you think there's a compassionate way to take the life of someone who is causing you no harm and just wants to live?
You see, your first principle that you've just explained there is flawed. And I'll tell you why it's flawed. Because the most important thing first is to accept whether there is or is not a creator. Why I say that is because if God has created that animal, Allah explains that we've created some animals for your consumption, some to be ridden and plough the fields.
Which animals?
So things like chicken, sheep, goats, these sort of things have been created for your consumption. Allah, so the very creation was created as a mercy to you. So you had something to eat, basically. Now, it's not talking about modern day farming, by the way, and it's not talking about the slaughterhouses that you and I both would detest, right? Not those things. But this was supposed to be a very organic, a very healthy way of living, where meat was the exception. And in fact, at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, it was the exception. It was not the rule. It was mainly a plant-based diet with a very occasional consumption of meat. Not the gorging 3 times a day that we sort of, a lot of society is involved in today, right? In fact, you're told not to consume meat in that way, not to eat meat in that way. The Prophet ﷺ has clearly made warnings in relation to that. So, but you see, when you say, is there a just way, a fair way of killing somebody?
Who has a preference to live?
Yeah, but you see, that's a weighted question. It's a weighted question because you've made certain assumptions.
Do you not think they have a preference to live?
Of course they do. Of course.
So where's the assumption?
No. The assumption is that you're somehow equating a level of consciousness and a level of reality that those animals might not have in relation to what you or I might have. I'm not saying that they don't have any concept, but I'm just saying to equate them to a human being is not fair.
Well, I don't think I haven't equated them to a human being. But if there's a grey area, we're not sure. Surely our best position. Surely the best position would just be to not take their life if we're not sure.
See, I would suggest that what a person should do is that clearly, and I mention the word if because obviously you don't believe in a creator, but if there is a creator, then surely the guidance from that creator would be better than anything you or I might be able to come up with. Do you understand my point?
Yeah.
And so fundamentally, I think humbly what I would suggest is address that core question first, because then only can you, I believe, really have an objective sense of truth when it comes to certain matters.
But I suppose a way to come to an objective truth is by having these discussions,
of course,
isn't it? Like hashing them out, and then us as society deciding what we believe to be true. And I think now that with more and more information that's coming out, like the environmental side, the environmental impact animal culture has, the health complications that come to it, heart disease is the leading cause of death.
Of course.
And then obviously the moral issue. If we don't need to be taking the animal's life, what justifications could we possibly have in our society? We should only be focusing, and I like to focus on the individual.
Yes.
It's the individual's choice. choice if they buy animal products or not. It's their individual choice if they promote these industries, and it should be the responsibility should always lie on the individual for the actions and choices that they make. And that's the reason I changed. Like, I used to eat animals for 32 years. I was raised in environments where I look after my cat, I take care of my cat. I was devastated when my cat was put to sleep, and I could never harm an animal myself personally, but I ate animals, and that's because my parents fed me those animals, and then as you grow up in society, it's just completely normal. We're led to believe it's normal, natural, and necessary to eat animals, but then when you actually present it with new information, I think that's when we can start making new decisions based on those information.
Though I agree with a lot what you've said, I would still humbly say that it's still a subjective rather than an objective reason. And our discussions will also lead to a subjective rather than an objective reason. And so that's why I keep bringing it back to the Creator, because, clearly, even if you don't believe in a God, you would at least concede that if there was one, with the majesty of the creation of this universe, etc., that God would probably have a better take, certainly a lot better than you or I, in terms of an objective reality, right? And so what I would suggest to you is that, look, this universe, for example, came into existence. At one point, it did not exist. And Allah asks the question in the Quran, did it give birth to itself? Did this universe give birth to itself? It asks you the question, and it asks you to contemplate, to think about these things. And I think intuitively, if, for example, this camera showed up in my house, you would never accept that it just popped up from thin air. You would always accept the reality, which is that it must have come from somewhere. It's a complex object. And so, similarly, this universe has come into existence. Animals exist, you exist, I exist. And so, pondering on that question as to where did it all come from, I think it's a very fundamental, very important question. And I think once you come to the realization that a lot of people who perhaps don't necessarily believe in God or a let's say, organized religion, they tend to be more agnostic. They believe in some sort of force, some sort of conscious force out there that created everything, let's say. But that's what I would urge you to do. Sorry, what's your name? Tim, Abbas, yeah? So what I say to him is that do ponder on those things as well, because when you look at Islam, for example, there is a lot in there that was way ahead of its time when it comes to animal rights, when it comes to the consumption of animals, how they believe animals should have rights. Absolutely, of course. And Islam gave them many rights, in fact. And the fact that they were given at 7th century, when even human beings generally didn't have any rights, it's a remarkable thing. So to overburden an animal is a sin. To beat an animal is a sin. To be cruel to an animal is a sin. In fact, we learn of a story of a woman who was punished severely because she tied up her cat and she did not feed it and she did not give it drink, and the cat died. And for that, Allah says she received a severe punishment because of her cruelty to the animal. So this concept of cruelty and the compassion to animals and how animals should be treated, if you think about it, in the 7th century, 1,400 years ago, when the average human being had no rights, it's quite a remarkable thing, I think.
So you said you're vegetarian.
Well, I eat fish, but generally I eat fish.
And why do you eat fish?
If I'm completely honest, I know that there's a lot of heavy metals like mercury and what have you in our fish.
A lot of plastic.
Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff in there. I would probably argue that I'm probably not strong enough, right, to just give it all up. But I do see fish as certainly a much lesser evil than a calf that's been taken away from its mother and it goes through quite a lot of trauma, and then it goes through that slaughter process and everything else. I think it's clearly far more cruel to do that to a cattle.
Well, what's the difference between the fish and the ability to feel pain and suffer, and their preference to live?
No, I think that there is for example, with most fish, generally, they are fairly organic in terms of how they live. So they're not in, like, for example, pork consumption or cattle consumption or sheep. Often they're kept, especially eggs and chickens, right? They're kept in a very, I think, inhumane way. So especially chickens with these cheap eggs.
Yeah.
I mean, the cages, they die, the corpses are in there, the chickens are pecking each other to death because they're going mad.
You've seen all this, yeah.
They chop the beaks off.
No, yeah.
I mean, to me, that's not how Allah had intended us to be eating eggs, quite frankly. So, but I do believe that there is definitely a marked difference between a chicken and keeping it in a cage in that way, and catching a fish and killing it and eating it straight away. I think there's definitely some difference there.
I had a really good quote recently. I talked about basically it's like free range animals. And the argument goes, killing a healthy, happy golden retriever is better than killing a sickly, depressed golden retriever.
Yes. I think the argument. Sorry.
Yeah. No, please.
I think I understand your point, and it's my reasons that I eat and so on is because it's the level of consciousness. Does that animal know whether it exists? Does it know that it's about to die, and is it wanting to live?
Yeah.
And I think that the meat I consume doesn't. And I think that I personally have raised chickens, ducks, quails, and rabbits for meat consumption for myself, for the reason you talked about, you went a bit the other side of it. So I believe that I shouldn't eat meat unless I can kill it myself and it's a good life.
Yeah.
And so if chicken, for example, do you mind if I explain how I killed the chicken that I ate? Is that okay? And then you can maybe empathise why I believe that it's fine to eat. So I hatched this chicken, and I raised it. I fed it every day, and even if I whistled, it would come up on my shoulder because it's going to get the food. I used to handle the chickens as well, so they're used to me handling them, so I pick them up and stuff like that.
You're not stressed, basically, when you handle them.
The time that I killed that chicken, I was handling it. It wasn't stressed at all. It was pecking at the food that I put in front of it, so it was thinking of good things. Oh, bless you, shivering. Are you alright?
Yeah, it's pretty cold. It's fine.
And I killed the chicken in the way Bass just mentioned. So it basically, from doing that, it faints. So if someone comes, right, I'm having a lovely conversation with you now. Someone come behind me now and I didn't even know. Yeah. There's no me going, oh, I want it to live. Oh, I'm going to die. I'm fearing and shaking, and that's the horrible bit. I've just gone.
Yes.
So that's why I believe that it's fine to eat meat in them circumstances.
So you would accept if someone came up to you and took your life to eat you without you knowing, you would just accept that?
Well, because I believe in afterlife, I wouldn't mind too much. And even if I didn't, there would be nothingness afterwards. What's important is from that chick's birth to its dying, it's had a happy life. Do you understand what
I do understand what you mean, but I would say that an animal that's having a happy life would have a preference to continue having their happy life.
Does it ponder that preference?
No, but we could say the same thing for humans that don't have the ability to experience reality the same way we do. Like a human that has the mental capacity of a chicken, could we then say, can we take their life?
Well, you see, that's why I was saying to you that. The reasoning and the comparison often that is made to human beings, humbly I would say, is problematic because that's an assumption, not a reality. Now, I can understand where it's coming from, so I'm not criticising. I'm not saying, oh, it's just pull it out, out of thin air. I can understand your reasoning, but ultimately, if there is a creator, if that creator has created certain animals for consumption, if that creator has told you what the humane way, and I think, mashallah, this brother's pretty much got it down to a T. If you can do it in the right way, which is what Allah has described, then, and Allah differentiates between a human being and a chicken. So, for example, if I didn't kill a chicken in a cruel way, it's a sin. I may be punished.
Yeah.
But if I kill a human being, it's a much greater sin.
Okay.
And the reason why is that first of all, because Allah has ordained this hierarchy, let's say, but also if you look at it logically, the consequences of killing a human being now are not just that he is affected, his children are affected, his wife or husband is affected, his parents are affected, his family is affected. It could have a real catastrophic snowball effect. His kids could be in trauma for the rest of their life, right? Now, clearly that's not going to necessarily be the case if the animals are reared in a very healthy way and the consumption is not, an extreme, every day, you're morning, night, and, you're having meat all the time, and that, you're not being cruel to the animals. I don't think you can compare the two. Do you see my point?
I see what you're saying. No, I see what you're saying. What would you say is an acceptable amount of animals?